It's funny to regard me as a savior, because what I tell people consistently is that they have to look to themselves. And it's not because I believe that people are in full control of their lives. You know, we're all subject to bad breaks and sometimes to terrible luck, but your best bet is to do what you can, to take care of yourself properly, to treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping, which is rule 2, by the way, partly because I do believe in this ancient, fundamentally Western idea that people are of intrinsic value. I mean, look, we're all given the sovereign right to organize our own states, the responsibility to vote. Our state, our very state, assumes that you have the wisdom to keep the ship of state sailing straight. And it's because there's something about you that, at least in principle, has the possibility of being remarkable if it can be manifested. And I'm reminding people that not only do we believe that, but that it seems to be true. And it isn't obvious to me that there is anyone, or there has been anyone for the last 4 or 5 decades, let's say, who's done a credible job of drawing a relationship between the meaning in life that you need to sustain you and responsibility. And not just for you, because it's not an individualistic idea. It's responsibility for you and your family and your community. There, that'll do the trick. And your broader society. Let me just... There's been this idea generated in the news by news people who keep reading the news that other news people create, that somehow I have a coterie of angry young white men surrounding me because they're angry about feminism and about all these other isms, let's say. And I don't see it like that at all. I'm trying to suggest to people that their best bet in life, and this is men and women alike, is to adopt as much responsibility as they can for their own lives. And I went through this already, because that's where the meaning in life is to be found. And the notion that that's somehow a message that's limited to young men it's an absurd message. Okay. Why would that be limited? I think the idea that the world would benefit from the movement of talent from both sexes into the workplace as rapidly as possible is something that anyone with any sense should share, given the rather the rarity of talent and the necessity for utilizing it.
So what is your advice to young people when you talk about you need to be individually responsible, but when there are things that are so far out of our control, like climate catastrophe, like the precarious job economy, like the
they're not as far out of your control as you think.
What is your answer?
Do you think that you're worse off than you think that you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think there are different challenges.
Do you think you're worse off than your grandparents?
Because the argument, I think, is that individual responsibility does not change the climate, does not fix the problem that needs global collective responsibility. So I think that's the core of the question. Do you have a theory about that?
Well, fundamentally, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been that people can do a tremendous amount of good for themselves and for the people who are immediately around them by looking to their own inadequacies and their own flaws and the things that they're not doing in their lives, and starting to build themselves up as more powerful individuals. And if they're capable of doing that, and then they're capable of expanding their career. And if they're capable of expanding their career and their competence, then they're capable of taking their place in the community as effective leaders. And then they're capable of making wise decisions instead of unwise decisions when it comes to making collective political decisions. I'm not suggesting in the least, and have never suggested, that there's no domain for social action. I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world, which happens in many ways.
If a young person believes that the climate, the global warming problem on the climate is something that needs to be tackled quickly, and they can't wait until they grow up and become prime ministers to do it, do you think collective responsibility overrides individual responsibility in a huge issue like that?
No.
Okay.
I don't. Okay. I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors.
Martin Luther King's dream was that there would come a time when people would not be judged by the colour of their skin but by the content of their character. How is today's identity politics consistent with that vision?
Jordan Peterson.
Well, I don't think it's consistent with that vision at all. I mean, the problem I have with identity politics as a mode of philosophical apprehension is that it's predicated on the idea that the appropriate way to classify people is by their group identity, in whatever fragmentary formulation that might take, in the multiplicity of ways that people can be divided into groups. And the classical, postmodern, and I would also say Marxist way of viewing the world, even though those two things shouldn't be allowed together, they tend to be, is that group identity takes priority over individual identity, and I think that's precisely the opposite of what Martin Luther King was hoping for and working for. And I think it's unbelievably dangerous, because partly because when you assume that people should primarily be identified by their group, then you can also attribute group guilt to them by their group. And then things go downhill very, very rapidly. And we've had no shortage of evidence of that sort of thing happening, say, throughout the 20th century.
Are there particular groups that you are more concerned about than others? For example, the Liberal Party, as Terry Butler said earlier, is a group. Are there groups that you think are more dangerous?
There isn't a problem with groups. The problem is with assuming that the fundamental way that you should categorize people is with their group identity. Obviously, we all belong to groups. The issue is whether or not the individual identity is primary and the group identity is secondary, or the group identity is primary and the individual identity is secondary. If you're a proponent, for example, of equality of outcome, of quotas, then you de facto accept the proposition that it's the group identity that is primary, and there's all sorts of dangers that are associated with that that far outweigh whatever good you're likely to do. We talk a lot about equality, but there's various forms of equality. There's equality of opportunity, which we discussed briefly, which I think is a very admirable goal. And then there's equality of outcome, which I think is I think it's a totalitarian impossibility, and I think it's often conflated with equality of opportunity. Equality of outcome, of course, is the doctrine that every occupation should be occupied by people in precise proportion to their proportionality in the population.
So quotas in politics, for example, or quotas in business as to how many women should be on boards, how many women should be politicians, that's what you're talking about.
Yes, quotas on the basis of group identity. Let's say, so for example, in Canada, our Prime Minister, an enlightened soul, decided that he would make 50% of the cabinet women, despite the fact that only 25% of the people who were elected in his party were female, which meant certainly from a statistical perspective that he did not hire the most qualified people for the cabinet, and he did that to virtue signal to his base, and it turned out to be a very big mistake. But I would also say a certain amount of persistence is called for. If you're mobbed on social media, a brief bit of advice by people who are doing exactly the sort of thing that you're describing, I would say two things. The first is be careful about what you've said and what you've said in the past, and maybe it's a bit too late for that. The second thing I would say is, if you haven't done anything wrong, do not apologize.
That is your minute.
And then wait 2 weeks, and it'll go away.
Terry Butler.